We're delighted. My name's Karen Robinson, and I'm the campaign worker at Conscientious. And we're delighted that Sam Mason can join us and speak with us. Fantastic. And yes, on the previous screen, just a little reminder that we are recording live. You probably saw that on the screen anyway, throughout, and we'll be sharing on our social media and afterwards. So we've got quite a long title for our webinar. How do we transform our military, including nuclear weapons and fossil fuel-based industrial production, to non-military, socially and ecologically useful production? And hear later that Sam's going to divide her talk into 3 parts, and then we have lots of chance to ask questions in between. Yeah, so it's an informal evening. Please feel free to join in the chat session at the bottom, post any comments or links that you'd like to share, and you're very welcome to ask questions, Sam, in the chat section too. My colleague Jonathan from Conscience will be sort of keeping an eye on the chat section and indeed doing all the tech work for us this evening. Thank you, Jonathan. You can also, if you prefer, you could ask your question live on video. If you just want to wave your hand, Jonathan will find you. Yes, and we're recording live. If you, many people may know, but just in case you don't, Conscience, the longer part of our title is Taxes for Peace, Not War. So we're quite a specific campaign. We campaign for a change in the law so that individuals can opt for the military part of their taxes to go for peaceful purposes instead. So having a sort of tick box on an income tax form. And as you probably know, in Britain, we got the right to conscientiously object to serving in the military, physical conscription, in 1916. And there's no physical conscription now. But we still engage in a lot of military action, and we're each forced to pay for the military through our taxes. So we campaign for an extension of that right to conscientiously object, or modern day financial conscription. And yes, we've had a series of webinars, all of which are available on our website, starting with a basic introduction to conscientious objection to military service, and going through some of the history in the First World War and Second World War, looking at current day conscientious objection in different countries, and then moving on to looking at the history of our own movement of conscientious objection to military taxation. And our last one was on reconciliation and peace building with Joe Berry. So yeah, you're very welcome to have a look at those. So since the foundation of Conscience, which was originally sort of called the Peace Campaign, we have regularly put in bills to try and achieve a peace tax bill. They've had sort of different names in different years. And the last one we did was into 2016, which was introduced by Ruth Cadbury. And it was quite a simple bill, and it had three sections. One talking about what the conscientious objection was and what people would need to do to indicate that they objected to on the military. The second one covered what we would want that peace tax that was collected instead to go to on non-military security. And there was a final section of the bill. And at the moment, we're preparing to introduce a new one in the 2022-2023 Parliament. Looking at the middle section of the 2016 bill that we put forward, and you can see that I've put in purple this was all about how we would see the allocation of the peace tax was collected, how it would fund non-military security. You can see that an aspect of that we described in the bill was the conversion of industrial production from military to non-military. And one of the big aspects that Sam will be covering in her talk. And you can see in that section of the bill last time in 2016 that we were advocating non-military security in response to military threats. That's what we've done in previous bills as well. And so there's a question whether in our next peace tax bill, the 2022-2023 one, whether we would wish, in addition, to allocate the peace tax non-military security in response to non-military threats, for example, the climate crisis and pandemic. So that would be in addition to in response to the military threats. The question we're still discussing. I'm not expecting us to look at all of this, but this is related to that discussion. This was a summary of the risks that the government felt were the top risks when they did a risk assessment in 2015. And they've put terrorism there, cyber attacks, direct international military conflict. A heading they put was instability. You've got public health there, so this is 2015, long before COVID, but talking about a pandemic influenza and risk of that. And major natural hazards was one of their headings. They don't actually use the word climate change or climate crisis. That was their assessment in 2015. So Sam's going to talk with us in 3 parts. This is the first part of her talk. She's going to talk to us about the Lucas Plan. I remember that from the 70s. She's going to talk about the original plan, the Lucas Aerospace Combined Shop Stewards Committee. It's a picture of them. And what they did, the groundbreaking work they did. And she's going to talk about the new Lucas Plan, which was developed around the 40th anniversary conference. And tell us about it. So then after that, we'll have sort of questions specifically on the Lucas Plan, the original one and the new one. And then Sam will talk more widely about defence diversification and the conversion of industrial production from military, including nuclear weapons, to non-military. And then again, we'll have questions, and Jonathan will be sort of facilitating those and gathering your questions from the chat section. And then in the third part of her talk, Sam will be talking about the just transition in ecologically useful production in response to the crisis. And then there'll be time for questions on that section, but also questions more widely. The issues interrelate, and you'll hear from Sam just how many different movements and groups she's in connection with and involved with and topics. So let Sam introduce herself properly. I'll just do a little bit. So Sam is a policy officer for the Public and Commercial Services Union, the PCS. And in her role there, she focuses on sustainability and climate change and the need for a just transition to a zero carbon economy. Sam represents a union within the Global Trade Unions for Energy Democracy Initiative and at the UK COP26 coalition, where Sam will be talking. And she has a special interest in defence diversification. So we're so pleased and grateful, Sam, that you can join us, especially in this incredibly busy time leading up to Glasgow and COP26. Wow, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karen, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you this evening. As Karen's outlined, I'll sort of go through in 3 parts and try and spend 10 minutes on each, and hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion. Yeah, as Karen said, I'm a policy officer at Public and Commercial Services Trade Union. So for those who may not be aware, we are a civil service, we are the biggest civil service trade union. So that's where most of our members are based, but we also have members in other public bodies such as museums and galleries, and of course what we call our commercial sector, our privatized members on outsourced government contracts. But of course one part of that is the Ministry of Defence, and we have a defence sector group which is on the civilian side. So we do actually have some industrial issues related to this whole agenda and discussion. So that's kind of my official role. As Karen said, I'm involved in a number of groups. I am an activist in my own right and alongside the day job. But of course, I'm in quite a privileged position that I get to do a day job that also enables me to do a lot of activism and combine my trade union activism with climate activism, with peace activism, etc. So I am a member of CND. I'm on the General Council at the moment. I'm also a Labour Party member, just to make that clear, although I'm not going to talk about different, obviously, political positions here, but and on Labour CND. I'm also part of the New Lucas Plan project, which I will talk about a little bit in a minute, and involved in lots of local campaigning as well, because one thing I've always felt, particularly being somebody who works in a trade union, I need to be involved in my local community as well, so not to get abstract away at the kind of higher level of the bureaucracy, if you like, from the real day-to-day struggles that obviously we have in our community. So I'm part of a lot of community campaigning as well. So that's just some of what I do, but a lot of this does cross over, and they're by no way single issues. And we use this term a lot now called intersectionality, and where they start to combine. And I think that's one of the interesting things, particularly in recent years, how we're seeing more and making more connections between what are a number of multiple crises that we're currently facing. And I think that's very important, why we start to talk about the Lucas Aerospace workers and their alternative corporate plan that they developed in the 1970s, and why we have a focus on that. So some of those crises is increased militarization. We've got the increase of automation as well, and digitalization. Obviously, we've got the climate crisis. I think additionally, we've got a global public health crisis with pandemics, and as most of you will probably be aware, COVID-19 unfortunately is just a symptom of what we are going to face more of in the future. And that's pretty much clearly why it's up there in those risk assessments of what are the real risks. And the other thing, and particularly as trade union, we've got a growing crisis of inequality, which has been absolutely highlighted through the COVID pandemic of the past 18 months or so. But why is the Lucas Plan story so important? And I'll apologize in advance for those who know the story very well, but then that's good, because then perhaps you can come and correct things and some of my understanding, we can have discussions about that. But I think we have to set it in its context. So obviously this was going back to the 1970s, Lucas Aerospace workers, a company involved in defense system production, who were faced with redundancies across a multiple of their sites as a result of rationalization and new computer controlled work. And also, if we put it in that context, particularly of the early 70s, when we're starting to see this growth of obviously the neoliberal era, monetarist economic policy, and what was kind of happening around that time as well alongside. But what was important, what started out as a more traditional fight against redundancies, and saw shop stewards across the Lucas Aerospace factories and regions, staff and manual workers combined to become one representative body, in what they saw as a response, a tactic of the management of Lucas Aerospace to divide them all across the different plants. And that was quite exceptional at the time. It's actually still quite exceptional now, and that's something we can come back to in terms of how the Lucas Aerospace workers organise themselves. But it clearly emerged through that of combining their forces together, that it wasn't just enough to fight to save the jobs within the same employment regime, that they needed to come up with an alternative strategy to this. And one of the things that emerged, that as the defence contracts were dependent on public money, is that the Combine argued that the state would better be supporting them in jobs, and they called for nationalisation of Lucas Aerospace at the time, and the state being better to put that money into producing goods that were socially useful and which were needed, and rather in this kind of competitive industry around the defence sector. And famously, as some be aware, they approached Tony Benn, who was in the Department of Industry, to see if he would support nationalisation, as he was currently looking at nationalisation of the aerospace industries at the time. But he instead said that wasn't something that he could achieve, but told them to go away and actually work on an alternative plan. This is what they did. And I think it's always a good quote to remind that as the shop stewards took up this suggestion and developed the Lucas Aerospace Alternative Corporate Plan, which I'll just come to in a minute. At the time, the Financial Times said that plans were one of the most radical alternative plans ever drawn up by workers for their company, and that was quite significant. But I think what was so radical about it was their approach, and it's how they organised to actually develop that plan, because they didn't just sit down as a group of stewards. They initially approached, it was 180 external organisations to try and come up with products that they could produce which were socially useful. Unfortunately, they only got 3 responses out of that. Famously, one of them was the Open University, who then did go on to work with the Shop Stewards Combine. But as a response to those poor responses, they then went out to the whole of the workforce, and not just their members, but the whole of the workforce, with a questionnaire for product ideas. And there was, I think it was 150 suggestions which came up, and some of those they worked up into the corporate plan as prototypes, and using their knowledge and skills that they had as a workforce, and also how they could use the plant which they already have. And it's kind of so scandalous, really, when we look back. The things that they were talking about then were wind turbines, they were solar cells, and the stuff now that we're actually still fighting to get on a sort of common basis as well. But I think what was also inherent, what was kind of radical about it, it was about how they saw technology, and seeing that technology had to be viewed through a political lens, not just something that's sort of abstract, and understanding that technology was the embodiment of workers' skills and knowledge, and a lot of it tacit knowledge as well. So not those things which are codified necessarily, but a lot of those process and interactions that we all have to our work, or other sort of social relationships that we don't necessarily write down and can easily pass over as well. So it was seen as with the new technology was de-skilling people and also making them redundant. But obviously, at a time when it was very clear, one of the examples always given is the lack of kidney machines, and yet they were working in a plant where they did actually make kidney machines, but they could be making more on public money. So again, for social benefit. And they also saw themselves as a workforce very much rooted in their community, and seeing that, it's not just about producing stuff that goes out down the line and gets shipped abroad or somewhere else in the country. It's about understanding and being part of their community as well. So extending beyond the workplace, which I think is very important to that. So we kind of fast forward 40 years, and Karen had mentioned about the anniversary. So some people got together to organise a conference on the 40th anniversary of the Lucas Plan, which obviously was developed in 1976. But the idea of that conference wasn't just to reminisce and be nostalgic about it, but it was actually to look at how could we revisit those ideas and initiatives that the Lucas Aerospace workers had then, and apply it to today's world with the increasing crisis, which I mentioned at the beginning, and actually many of those which are now far worse, even just 5 years on from that conference. So it brought together peace activists, it brought together environmentalists, it brought together trade unionists as well. And I think everybody that came felt it was not just a success, and I know we're all very good at saying our things are successful, but there really was an inspiration, enthusiasm that came out of that conference. And coming from that, we developed the new Lucas Plan project, which was really to try and build on some of the ideas and bringing such a different mix of people together that don't normally sort of naturally meet in spaces together, which was really important. So we set that up following the conference. We established four working groups within the project, which was to cover defence diversification and arms conversion, just transition, local planning and automation and digitalisation. So some of that we can come back to later. But what we've really been doing as a project is trying to take those ideas. We've run several meetings in Manchester, London, Derby, I think it was, Newcastle as well, of bringing people together to try and look at how we can apply that to today's issues, and particularly in an industrial context as well. So I think we can come on to some of those discussions we've now had around arms conversion, defence diversification, for example. But I think what was really important, and as well relating to today's discussions about just transition and the climate crisis and the things that we need to be doing, it's really about understanding how we can put workers in the driving seat of change, but working also within our communities, not just outside. And I just think that the final thing I'd say in this, before we sort of open this up to questions, I found it really interesting because I was 10 when the Lucas Aerospace plan was developed. So that will give away my age. But growing up, that's always been a backdrop to sort of my industrial, history and, what was the discussions. But as we were preparing this conference and I started to raise it within trade union circles and try to get trade unions on board, I just kept hearing, but it failed. Yes, it was good, but it failed. And I was quite shocked by that because it's not what I was expecting. I was expecting a lot of enthusiasm. And I always say the Lucas Plan didn't fail. We failed it to some extent in the trade union movement because it wasn't taken on by the bureaucracies of the trade union movement who wanted to do direct negotiating with the bosses, so to speak, and also through the Labour Party at the time. And also, as I said, we have to look historically as well, the kind of trajectory of where we were with the capitalist system, then changing to this sort of more neoliberal economics and monetarist policy. So it was going against the tide of everything that was happening. But those ideas are reviving again. Lots of young people are now coming to these ideas, and it's been interesting in the past year where I've been involved, and I'm sure you all have, with a lot of webinars and sessions like this, and it's constantly coming up in the chat and people referring to it. And I think, that is really refreshing. And I think people are desperately looking for new ways of trying to organise and take on the challenges that we have now. So I'll just stop for this section and hopefully we can have some questions and then move on. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Sam. That was really, really interesting, really, really informative. So I'd like to now take some questions. As Karen said previously, you can write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand there's a button on the participants section, or old-fashioned style, put your hand up. I should say physically put your hand up. It's a bit more appropriate, about the Lucas Plan and about what Sam has been talking about. Ian, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I remember, Sam, I went to a meeting with Tony Benn, inevitably, I guess, and people from Lucas Aerospace in London, in central London. But thinking back, can you tell me, were similar plans being developed in other companies? Because I don't recall anything mentioned at the time.
Yeah, there were similar plans being developed. I mean, I think Vickers was one of the common ones. So it was there was a general feeling and movement then around workers' control and what we call industrial democracy, of having more involvement. So, but I think perhaps what was quite different about the Lucas experience was some of this more political understanding about this process and some of the processes that they went through, and making this a movement as well. So that there were definitely other things that were happening, and you know, have been in other countries as well. But I think nothing just quite as unique as the Lucas Aerospace workers.
Any other questions for Sam? Monica, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you, Sam. I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about the sort of products that Lucas Aerospace then, and possibly Lucas Aerospace now, are thinking of diversifying into, and whether any of them did that, whether they did manage to do any diversification at all back in the 1970s and 80s. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica. Well, Lucas Aerospace doesn't exist anymore. Like everything else, it's been merged into other companies. Yeah, they didn't diversify at all, because what they wanted to do, I mean, this was a period also of more increased capitalization, so trying to get rid of workers. So the Lucas Aerospace management wouldn't entertain any discussion about the alternative corporate plan, unfortunately. So that's the real tragedy of it. You know, we could have been making these things a long time ago, which we so desperately need now. But the Lucas Aerospace workers and the combine, you know, shop stewards combine, they did work with some, sorry, I'm just trying to remember the acronyms now. So the North London Polytechnic, for example, trying to develop some of the prototypes as well. So, you know, they were technically trying to use their skills to actually develop these things and market them, but the actual company wasn't interested at all.
Thank you. Any further questions before Sam starts the next section, Karen?
Monica was also asking what sort, if you could say a bit more about the different sorts of products that they were advocating and saying that they could produce.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, they were, let me just find my notes there. I mean, they had, as I said, I think it's about 150 products, which they separated down into about 4 categories, I think it was, sorry, six categories. So it's medical equipment, transport vehicles, improved banking systems, energy conservations, oceanics, and telecaric machines. And I think the ones which are more sort of famously talked about is in the transport vehicles. So they had this road rail bus as well, which would go on the road and then convert onto the railway tracks, which they did develop. And that was linked to particular power pack technology. So again, that would be very useful in some circumstances. I mean, on the medical side, they did develop kind of aids to enable disabled children, particularly for, you know, to help with mobility and stuff like this. So there was a vast number of products, and they did prototypes for wind turbines as well. So you know, and I think that's what's really unique as well. They were actually developing these things, you know, they had them all drafted out, and you could, I can put the website links in the chat later, but the Shop Stewards Combine have now developed their own website where all this information is on there. I mean, the document is quite incredible that they produced. It's a very serious document. So, I mean, I do encourage people to go and look at it. It's a wealth of information. And, you know, the former shop stewards, a few of them are still active. I mean, obviously, sadly, some have passed away now, but some are still quite active. And speak at meetings, which is great. And, I do find it a privilege and quite incredible that I've been able to meet some of them and have conversations, and they've still got a passion for this, although I think they are getting a little bit tired now and want other people to take on the mantle. So hopefully some of us and some younger people, even than me, will start to do.
Any last questions for Sam before she starts the second section? No? Okay.
Okay, shall I
Yeah.
stop? Great. All right. Yeah, so as Karen mentioned in this section, I was just going to cover more specifically the conversion of industrial production from military to non-military purposes. And I just say at the outset, I mean, we tend to talk about defence diversification in the trade union movement. I think sometimes in the peace side, and peace activists tend to talk about arms conversion. Personally, fine with both. And I think when we have a working group on this, and quite early on, which we set up after the Birmingham conference, and we took a pragmatic decision that we weren't going to get hung up about the language, but to use more pragmatically, depending obviously in which context, because unfortunately for the trade union movement, arms conversion can be a little bit prickly with some of the trade union movement, and this whole topic can be as well. But I think, and just to start with that, one of the things about the conference coming out of this, it did open up a space again for this whole discussion around socially useful production and arms conversion, defence diversification, which enabled us within the trade union movement. And so in 2017 at TUC Congress, there was a motion that was passed for the TUC to start working with the Labour Party to set up a shadow defence diversification agency. Now, if anybody understands the kind of politics from the trade unions about this, that was a very historic motion to get through, because the trade unions, mainly the GMB and Unite, with members in the defence sector, have been very hostile to this agenda. But Unite did actually back the motion. So that was very significant at the time. Again, things are always kind of relevant to context. Of course, we did then have a Labour Party leader that was also supporting defence diversification and obviously advocating a peace agenda as well. So within the broader Labour movement, there was an opportunity to open up some of these discussions. Unfortunately, in the trade union movement, those discussions didn't really go very far. Not much was done to develop them. And obviously now we're in a very different place altogether. But there was a great deal of activity around that time of trying to take some serious look at what would we mean by defence diversification. And particularly now we start looking at that in terms of the climate crisis as well, and what kind of jobs people working in the defence sector could move into. And there's numerous studies that have been done from, the campaign against the arms trade did studies around arms to renewables. There's other, I think the Green Party did some studies as well. So there's lots and lots of pieces of work. And the Nuclear Education Trust in 2018 also did a major report at looking defence diversification and arms conversion globally, at the history of that. And that was another important piece of research. So it really opened a good space for a lot of these discussions. Now, we have to also be clear that, of course, under the Blair Labour government, they did actually establish a defence diversification agency, well, sort of. They quickly privatised it. It became Kinetic, and they actually used it as a vehicle. They catered it within the sort of defence side and used it as a vehicle to actually create defence products to take to market. So it wasn't the kind of defence diversification agency that clearly we were looking to have. But we were starting to manage to have some conversations with MPs about this and to push this agenda as part of a wider industrial strategy. And also around that time, even Theresa May was starting to talk about, industrial strategy that has not been popular in political discourse for a long period of time. So that was quite significant. But we do unfortunately have a lot of hostility towards this agenda still in the trade union movement, and a battle on this, because, to put it crudely, from the GMB trade union, for them it's jobs. It's just jobs. It doesn't matter what the jobs are. We need jobs, and you're kind of selling our workers down if you're not going to support jobs in the defence sector, regardless of what those jobs are. Yes, I did just say Blair Brown privatized something. Yes. So that's one of the struggles we have on that side. But I think it's also worth remembering, obviously unions like Unite, before they merged and became Unite in their former incarnation as the Transport and General Workers Union, they actually did a lot of work around this area, and they did actually advocate defence diversification themselves. And even the TUC in 2011, just post the financial crash, had motions on economic diversity, non-renewal of the Trident project, and actually using that peace dividend into other sort of public sector and other projects. So it's quite a recent turn in some respects. If you think from 2011 to 2017, when we had that motion, something has sort of changed in our movement around that, unfortunately. So it is still a struggle around there, but I think we have tried to use these ideas of the Lucas Aerospace workers and really instill that actually, what we are talking about is having those conversations with workers in the defence sector or nuclear sector, particularly around Trident, and that this is money that could be much better invested into jobs and alternative jobs. And of course, the renewable sector is an obvious one, particularly when you're looking at where some of the nuclear defence sector jobs are. And there's high levels of transferable skills, but what we're stuck on really, and this starts to go into the next conversation around just transition, is really about the processes to make this happen. And I have sympathy with the Unite trade union, for example, because and particularly as this previous Labour regime had actually privatized this, that they have little faith in the politicians actually doing what they say they're going to do. And I think that has been borne out through a lot of studies, and there's a very good book that was written, or report that was written just at the beginning of the 1980s, that from the Liverpool and several other trade councils, trade union councils, where they really felt let down by the politicians with all these commitments to kind of support for trade unions and industrial conversion and jobs, and really not seeing that in reality when they had a chance to actually do something about it. But I think now those discussions are more important than ever, because we've just seen, and I'm sure I clearly won't need to tell anybody here, we now have a government that's committed to the biggest defence sector budget in 70 years. When you compare what they're committing in that to what they're committing to climate change as part of the green industrial revolution, it's just a nonsense. And we know obviously the Australia, UK, US deal that's just been agreed as well, sadly is being seen by some trade unions as a great opportunity for jobs, and it's just very difficult to cut through that. They argue this will be about manufacturing jobs, and anybody who opposes it is opposing jobs for the working class in these sectors, which is a nonsense in my view. That's clearly not what people are talking about. And I think for many of us working around this space, if we want to deal with climate change, we have to do it on the basis of a peace agenda, because the whole military carbon footprint is massive, and this all plays into it. And there's lots of work that needs doing. There's lots of ways in which we can transfer these skills across into socially useful and ecologically useful, we would add in as well these days, to work that needs to be done. And I think it's, you know, when we look at what's happened to investment in public services, for example, and, you know, as part of C&D, we've got this campaign at the moment, Nurses Not Nukes. When you look at, you know, the amount of money that is intended to be invested and will be invested in the nuclear program, we've got, you know, valuable public service workers in the health service that's being run down that could be invested into something which we desperately need, and which we saw through the pandemic is desperately needed. And I think, just coming back to the pandemic and finishing on this point, perhaps, what we saw happen last year was quite incredible. We saw high levels, trillions of government investment, billions of government investment. We saw production lines repurposed overnight to produce ventilators and stuff for the pandemic. That was done in Broughton in North Wales at so I forget who the factory is now, but you know, was done in consultation with the trade unions down there, where they, you know, as part of the ventilator challenge, and we actually started producing ventilators. So this can be done when the agreement's there, when the need is seen. We can do this, you know, it's not impossible. So this whole idea that somehow it's too difficult, the jobs won't exist, you know, is a nonsense. We've now seen, we've got that proven. It didn't just happen in the UK, that happened right across the world. So we need to get that same level of urgency, and it's really disappointing that, unfortunately, the trade unions didn't take that one step further then and say, we're doing this now, well, let's stop producing the arms and the other things. Let's now make sure that we advocate for this work to continue to be socially and ecologically useful work, and not for the defence and arms sector. But interestingly, we are starting to see some of the application of Lucas plan type thinking into some of the manufacturing sectors of Unite. I'm not saying they're necessarily promising in what they want to produce, because I think one of those is going to be related to small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, which isn't great, but at least some of the application of the thinking is starting to emerge a little bit around some of the industrial struggles, which we haven't really quite seen before. And I think, given where we are today, we've seen the end of furlough, the uplift in universal credit as well. We've seen lots of workers laid off across, and, you know, there's huge amounts of work that needs to be done. So I think, you know, we do have an opportunity in space at the moment to sort of push this agenda again. Thank you. So I'll pass you back over for.
Thank you again, Sam. Thank you. Got any questions for Sam following that? Just hang out. Please don't be shy. Donald.
Yes, hello. And I just wonder, with the power of the industrial, military industrial arms complex, and the strength that they have and the money they have, what the chances of achieving this change would be, you know. Of course, they always use the employment situation as being an excuse for continuing it, but the basis of all of it is the military and arms industrial complex, who are really have so much influence. The lobbying they're able to do and the connection with whatever government is in is so strong. One feels that it's going to be very difficult to break this chain of arms manufacturing and so on. What are your feelings, please, about that? Have you got any feelings about that, Sam?
Yes, I got plenty of feelings about that. I think probably like you, I feel quite not particularly hopeful in some respects. But you know, we always have to have hope, of course, and that's why we're all here doing things that we're doing and trying to find ways to break this. And you know, we have stand by that. I mean, I think partly, you know, and we should never blame workers for the jobs that they do, you know, by and large. You know, and when I talk about GMB, there's lots of members in there who work in these sectors. You know, they are thinking people, they see what's going on around them. They don't necessarily want to do these jobs, but there's no alternatives. So until we can provide a real alternative for workers, then unfortunately this is going to continue. So we really do need to get the alternatives. You know, develop our own alternative strategies, but use that as part of industrial strategies and at a senior level of trade unions as well. Because I think if workers start fighting back, that's one opportunity to at least break some of that. But the power of the lobbying, I mean, you know, and I see this on the fossil fuel side as well, you know, and it all comes together. It's all part of the same, you know, side of the coin, as they say, because it all supports each other. So it's not easy, but part of it also is building our alliances across and making sure we join up this agenda, because that's one of the problems, this whole military industrial complex side. So when you hear discussions about the Green New Deal, they never put this on there. They never discuss it, even in the US, where obviously it's a bigger issue there than it is here. They never discuss it, but we're starting to break through on that a little bit. So I think once we can bring this more to people's, you know, consciousness, then hopefully we can fight back a bit about that. I can see Monica's got her hand up.
One has to be optimistic, doesn't one, really?
Monica.
I was going to say that I wonder whether more can be done by pointing to the example of the firms, for example, the ones that did repurpose themselves during the pandemic to make ventilators, whether we can explain these examples more to wider audiences to show, look, you know, it's not a case of military production or no job. You know, there are alternatives, you're skilled people, you can do other things. And I feel that not enough is these initiatives, such as repurposing your whole production line to make ventilators, just don't get sufficient publicity. And that perhaps if there was more that could be done to show these examples, to, you know, talk to the work, get the workers from the repurposed companies talking to other workers, perhaps more, that we could actually make it easier for people to understand that diversification doesn't mean losing jobs.
Yeah, I think you're right, Monica. And we have to share these stories and get them out to wider audiences. And I think, you know, one of the problems we have is trying to get to workers to actually have these conversations. That there's a lot of blocks at the level of trade unions. And, you know, we had a meeting which was organized through, I think it was Scottish CND, a very good meeting. We had a convener there from Fastlane. I don't know if some of you may have been at that meeting, and talked, you know, and talked about some of these issues. And, you know, one of the things he said was that, you know, the problem is that you don't talk to unions and workers. Well, like, we try to, you know, and I'm in the movement, but we can't get to the workers and have these discussions, and that this is part of the problem. So it's trying to get there at that base, and to certainly to try and bring out these stories as well, because, you know, as I just said, you know, workers are thinking people, they don't live in a kind of vacuum to everything that's going on around. And, you know, most of them would be quite open to thinking about alternatives, I'm sure, but as long as obviously they've got some security in that. And, you know, I do know, I just happened to meet one young man, he used to work in the industry in Scotland. He's actually come out, he's gone into academia now because he just hated working in that whole sort of military industrial complex, you know. So if we get people like this, which are really important, who can then come and talk about their experiences and why, you know, because he wants to use his skills for more useful things. You know, and I think having some of those stories are really important as well.
Great. Any more questions for Sam before Jackie?
I was just thinking COP26 is coming up. And if workers could be told that instead of having a job making bombs, you had a job making wind farms, so that it would be cheap to make wind farms, then their electricity bills in the long run would go down. So it'd be win-win. They have a job and their bills at home would be less. Just a thought.
Well, perhaps that might be a good point for me to go on to the next section, because that was actually about just transition and really the climate crisis, and, you know, mentioning COP26, because I think this is a really important point as well. And I mean, I don't know if many of you saw, I think it was in August, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with their latest report, which the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres said this was code red for humanity. Now that's quite a strong statement. I mean, because those reports, even the one in 2018, which really set off a lot of the Extinction Rebellion activism and school student strikes, was quite a hard assessment of where we are on climate change and its impacts. The one this year was even harsher. Those reports are signed off by governments around the world. So my expectation is that the current crisis is even worse than what we're being told. You know, and that's not just to sort of, you know, scare people, because I think it's very tricky how you talk about some of these things, because, you know, we're seeing climate breakdown around us. We're seeing it more in the UK now with flooding this summer, and even in my area, I'm sat in northeast London, we had flooding locally 3 times over the summer. Of course, nothing like the horrendous pictures we saw from China or Germany, but still, you know, that's people's homes impacted with lasting damage, and concerns now every time we get a downpour, understandably. But so I think, you know, it is really critical. And I think what is interesting, and as I was starting to allude to, this whole side around the sort of militarization and its climate cost, I mean, let alone, you know, financial costs and human lives and everything else, is huge. We don't talk about it. It doesn't get counted in the, you know, the Paris Climate Agreement, carbon budgets. It's all outside. Now, scientists for global responsibility have started to do quite a bit of work around this. It's very hard to measure the carbon emissions of military industrial complex for a variety of reasons, but the one thing that is clear is obviously that whole movement of sort of troops and everything that goes with it around the world has enormous climate impact. And the other side of it, and we will probably start to hear a lot of this in November when the climate talks actually start, and they're taking place from the 31st of October to the 12th of November. It's about climate change being a security threat. Now, this is already how the US talk about this, and they have done for a long period of time, when John Kerry was actually under the Obama administration. This is, you know, they're actually talking those terms, and the US military has done a lot of analysis of the climate impacts on their operations. So even when Trump was pulling out of the climate agreement, you know, I never quite felt that the US would disappear from these discussions, because actually they got such a vested interest in the discussions. because they were starting to see the impacts on their bases. And if you think about where a lot of the military operations are, just now in Afghanistan is one of the most climate insecure countries in the world, you know, and that's a terrible tragedy in many levels, obviously, of what's happening in Afghanistan, particularly over the past 20 years, and the occupations, which is not being talked about at all in since the troops have pulled out of there. But so I think it's important we start to get this on the agenda, and there are a group that has now come together internationally that we've just started meeting to try and get a bit more of a narrative around this. I'm not saying we're going to make huge inroads with everything else that's going on around the climate talks in November, but I think the fact that we've even started to now make these links is really important, because we can't see these as separate issues, and solving the climate crisis has got to be about a peace agenda. It absolutely has to. That there's no other way that we can do this, because also it's about, you know, when they talk about it being about security, what they're talking about is resource wars. What they're talking about is refugees. What they're talking about is people coming to their borders. And you'll see already putting fences up across Europe, and everything that's going on with cybersecurity and everything else. This is all planning for that scenario, when actually what we should be doing is clearly welcoming people, helping people, doing transfers of technology, assisting and working in a global cooperation around this issue. And it's quite interesting. I mean, the point that you raised, Jackie, about the alternative jobs. Yes, absolutely. One of the areas I work on a lot is energy, public ownership of energy, and part of this global initiative of trade unions. And what we're advocating for is that we won't make the transitions we need at the scale and pace that's required unless we have it under public ownership, but with levels of democratic control. So not just sort of some state nationalism, but a way that enables, you know, a more participatory democracy and the decisions being taken around that. Because the quickest things we can do, and it's so tragic that this has been talked about since the 80s, is actually retrofit and insulation of our homes. You know, in the UK, we have some of the leakiest energy inefficient homes in, you know, in Europe, and that all feeds into fuel poverty. And with the current energy crisis, if we've been investing in these things, I mean, wouldn't have been totally, you know, outside of the energy crisis, but we wouldn't be suffering the huge impacts we have now. And it's you know, for all governments that have just not invested in this at all, and in the housing stock and everything that we're doing. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of the climate crisis, that it has to be what we call a whole economy approach. It's not just about energy transition. Everything links up, everything will be impacted. We have to look right across the board for the changes that we're making. And it's a real shame, actually, because I mentioned the young man I'd sort of met a couple of years ago who'd come out of the defence industry. One of the things we had been planning is to do a little tour of the Scotland industrial military complex during the COP. But of course, with COVID, that's all had to been, we can't do that now, because he's lots of useful knowledge about all the sort of hidden parts of the industry up there that you just don't see. So we thought that would be an interesting project to do. I mean, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to come back and do that at some point. But, you know, I think, you know, we need to be aware that these things are happening on our doorstep, you know, in the UK. You know, so we often talk about America because it's far more visible, but that is very much here, and of course linked into all of this and part of the energy debate. I think also, don't want to make everything depressing tonight, but one of the other thing that depresses me is the trade union movement now has given its support to advancing nuclear energy and building more nuclear power plants. So we have a split across this in our trade union movement, but that particularly depresses me because of the link between the defence agenda on nuclear, and that's been admitted now by governments. That's no secret. They want to keep the civilian nuclear program alive so that they can basically use that to keep skills in the industry for the defence side as well. And that is, you know, and in the context of the discussions that you're having about, you know, taxes, we're paying for that through our energy bills. We're actually subsidising the nuclear defence program. you know, which I don't think people realize. And there are a couple of really good academics, if you've not come across them, at the University of Sussex, Phil Johnson, and his partner's name's just gone out of my head at the moment, but who have really written extensively on this and really done their research. And it's really good to read some of their work if you're interested. Obviously, they get a lot of criticism for what they're saying, but it's quite powerful. And it's been fantastic that they've highlighted this in a really good way. But I think, yeah, so just perhaps to finish on this with the COP, I am part of the UK COP coalition. I partly is representing my trade union there on the coordinating committee, but it's a group of civil society groups, trade unionists, but not just environmental campaigners. It's also faith groups, race groups, social justice groups, and the whole program about this is really about what we're calling climate justice. And I think sometimes, you know, the way I talk about this, if we're confronted about the jobs issue, is I don't think anybody in the UK, sorry, excuse me, should be fighting for jobs that are actually going to go and kill other people in other countries, other working class. That is just wrong. We're supposed to be built on a movement of solidarity. That is our word. That is what we exist for. So our solidarity has to extend, not just as a simple statement that we say at an end of a meeting, but actually in the actions in which we do. And therefore, there's no solidarity by maintaining jobs that are going to kill and harm other people elsewhere in the world. And a lot of those, obviously working class people, obviously in the global south as well, and poor communities. And it's a slightly different issue, but there's pre-COP talks in Italy at the moment. They are also a partner to the COP process this year. It's not just the UK and Scottish governments. So I was invited to a civil society meeting there last night, and they had a young activist from Bangladesh, and she talked about the impact of climate change in her country and where she lives, and it's devastating, you know. And I think these are also stories that trade unionists need to hear, because when they're fighting for those jobs in the fossil fuel industries, this is the impact of those jobs on people like this young woman and her community and what they're suffering. So this is why we argue for climate justice, and that's what solidarity has to be, and we have to work out these solutions collectively. It's not easy, and as all the work that you're doing, the stuff we're doing here around the peace agenda, none of it's easy, but obviously we can find a way through it if we want to, and we have to want to. So I will just finish on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think I speak for everyone. So the whole thing has been really, really interesting and informative, and you covered a lot of ground. Are there any questions on that last part, or on anything really related to what Sam's spoken about tonight? I'm sure someone must have a question. Monica.
It seems to me that there's quite an urgency to tackle the energy issues, in particular the need for insulation. It seems so obvious to me that insulating homes benefits on so many bases. It saves energy, keeps people warmer, it creates jobs. It's what the Extinction Rebellion people Insulate Now are calling for. Why can't we make it happen? It's something that seems to me fairly straightforward, relatively risk-free. Can't we make it happen?
Well, I agree with you, Monica. We should be able to make it happen. I'm not really sure why it never happens. I mean, this government had the Green Homes grant, not enough money put into it, makes it largely unaffordable. for most people to do, you know, and if you're sort of relatively comfortable income wise, it's still quite expensive to do. But I mean, it is one area of consensus we have in the trade union movement, at least. None of us disagree that this should be a priority area. And we also think, you know, it will create lots of jobs. You can do it on a local area basis, and that's what we advocate for. That, you know, a bit like we've obviously seen with the COVID crisis, and where, you know, we've been arguing to have test and trace and all these things and done on a local level, and manage there, that you could do insulating on that, because local authorities, you know their communities, they know the streets, they can do a plan, we can do it street by street, and we can train workers properly to do it, and, you know, and give real skills as well, because that's the other side of, unfortunately, in this country, we do not invest and we do not train people properly. So we need to tackle the whole education system, both obviously at school age and further education as well. And you know, there's someone I work with from the University of Westminster who does a lot of stuff around the construction sector and vocational education and skills, and, you know, she just talks about what they do in Germany to train workers, particularly around insulation and retrofit and stuff, compared to here. It's a 5-year apprenticeship training with real skills and real lasting jobs as well, which of course, you know, everything here is just like done, you know, they send you on a 6-week course or something and then expect to send you out. So that there's still lots and lots of issues about it, and no government gets it right. And it is something so simple that we should be able to do and desperately need to do. And it's been argued for so many years that the first thing we need to do is energy efficiency. It's not rocket science, as they say. So don't talk about rockets though, people going to the moon and wasting lots of money on that. That's a whole new area. But yeah, totally agree. But, you know, I guess at a political level, we just all have to push wherever we can in the spaces. But, you know, come into like the discussions that clearly you're having, which I think are really interesting and important, around taxation and what happens to our taxes. You know, just in my local area, there are some individuals that are now refusing to pay local council tax in relation to investment in a new incinerator project. So, you know, there are questions about, you know, that sort of political democracy about where our taxes go and what they get spent on. And certainly they should be spent on far better things than often what they are being spent on.
Thanks, Sam. Any last questions for Sam? No? In which case, oh, Donald, yeah.
Yeah, let's just say one thing. Very few people know that the carbon footprint of the whole military system is never recorded or never detailed at all. And it must be something massive when you think of the tanks and jet planes and everything involved in the military involves a terrific amount of carbon footprint development. Yet it is a fact that it's never recorded. And I think if as individuals were got this out to the public, because when COP26 comes up, there's got to be all this talk about cutting your carbon footprint for individuals. And yet the military, there's no control of it all, it appears.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, Donald. Entirely agree. And, you know, Scientists for Global Responsibility and Stuart Parkinson are doing some work around this, which is really important. So, I mean, you know, Stuart's really good. Every time he does a presentation at a meeting, he puts that on the website. So you don't have to sort of do a lot of digging around for that information. So do visit their website. There's a lot of information on there about that, and some really good work. Because yeah, it's about, you know, a lot of their carbon footprint is actually protecting their installations, you know, and or their bases right across the world. It's quite, you know, astonishing. And I think one of the other worrying things, which I was just reading about a few months ago, is they want to start investing in kind of small nuclear reactors, which of course obviously is used in submarines at the moment, but putting those, being able to set those up around their bases as well, so they don't have to do these convoys of oil and everything across the world. Because actually that's where a lot of their casualties come from. They get targeted, and you're just like, yeah, this is very worrying. The kind of direction of the thinking in that, and you know, and they'll put solar panels on things, and they'll start investing in kind of renewables technology, but obviously it's not for the right things and for a peaceful world. And you know, and the money that's invested in that, you know, which is trillions of dollars, and which could go into the things that we need to be doing, and would create so many more jobs than, you know, what workers are getting now in the defense sector. You know, in the US, here, anywhere, there is an enormous amount of work that needs to be done for the transitions that we need. So I think the more that we can highlight this continuously, the better, because it's, I think most people would find it really crazy once they understand and see those numbers compared to what we are doing and investing in, you know, particularly in the UK, but not just the UK, in climate. And yeah, and I think I'll just say, actually, I forgot to add just before we finish, this concept of just transition. We talk about it a lot, and it comes from the trade union movement, but I think there's an important point around there which we often missed in the kind of history of how this language has developed. And it does come from the sort of 1970s environmental movement, and a very visionary US trade union leader who was in the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers Union, who was anti-nuclear weapons. And you know, one of the arguments he said, I mean, he unfortunately died some time ago, but one of the arguments he used to use with the nuclear workers and atomic workers was, well, what are you going to do when peace breaks out? Are you going to argue for war? Are you going to argue, you know, of course you're not. This is a nonsense to argue that you need these jobs. So, you know, I think often we have to kind of turn these things on their head, so people start to see the logic breakdown of what they're calling for. You know, and I think that's quite powerful, because he actually worked in that sector. So for people like me, he's in a public sector union, you know, we get told, well, it's okay, you don't have members there, it's not their, you know, your members' jobs. But I think our argument for that is that, you know, for my union, we don't argue for more unemployment to keep our job centres open. You know, these are just nonsense arguments. You know, we have to argue for real jobs as well, and that are going to be good for workers too, because they also should be doing work that they, you know, can enjoy and is socially useful as well, and feel like contributing in society in a good way.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you, Donald. Any final questions for Sam before we finish up? No, in which case I think the only thing left to say is a big thank you to Sam. It's been a really, really interesting and informative discussion. So thank you for that. I'm just going to share some information. Our next webinar is just over a month, well, about 2 months' time, just under 2 months' time, Thursday, 25th of November, Why We Need Non-Military Security, with Paul Rogers from Bradford University, I'm sure you're all aware of. So if you want more information on that, please visit our website. You can register there. And feel free to email us if you've got any questions about that or about today's webinar. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to leave the call open for a few minutes. So if people do want to carry on talking, they're welcome to. Equally, if you want to leave, please don't feel any need to stay. So thank you very much, and all feel free to unmute yourselves as well if you wish to.